everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Joe Moore here, coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. Today I'm joined by Greg McKee, CEO, Chairman of Tryp Therapeutics. How you doing today, Greg?
I'm doing great, Joe. Good to see you, and thanks for having me around. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to have this conversation. In this pre-conversation we had for the last 15 minutes, I just got really excited. Sounds like we've got a lot to get into. You've got a lot going on at your company. And we had some really nice commentary about the space in general, discussions with investors and all that kind of fun stuff. This is a really interesting time, a ton happening in the space. And,
For
what
sure.
I was most interested about is Tryp Therapeutics off the cuff, like not necessarily looking at depression or like another somewhat typical psychiatric indication, right? Like
Right,
what we normally
exactly.
see. What are y'all looking at?
Yeah, so we're first of all, we're very excited about what's going on in the space overall, right? Like long term, we just I personally feel like this is going to be a space that really has a lot of breakthrough therapies for patients, which ultimately at the end of the day is a fantastic thing to do, right? Of course, it's like you're saying, Joe, a whole bunch of companies are plowing into depression, PTSD, treatment-resistant depression, anxiety, all sorts of areas like that, which is great. And we're rooting for all of them, by the way, right? We want everybody to be successful, and we think there's plenty of room. But we also know from our own research and research with academic partners of ours that there's a lot of potential for activity of psychedelics in certain areas outside of those areas. And specifically what we're focused on is looking at the two areas of chronic pain, and a very specific of chronic pain, which we can talk about maybe in a minute or two, and another area in the eating disorders arena. So those two broad categories is kind of where we're headed. Yeah. So very different, areas, but there's a very, obvious mental connection, of course, which we can get into a little bit later. But yeah, those areas, and within that, there's a bunch of subcategories as well. But we think that there's, huge opportunity to unleash the full potential of psychedelics well beyond traditional mood disorders.
Amen. Yeah, this has been something that's been kind of bothering me for a long time. Is the discussion gets really pigeonholed, and it's like there's a lot more to look at than the standard talk track. So I'm glad you're kind of going for that, and I'm really happy to see pain be on the list. Chronic pain sufferer, have friends with broken backs, chronic pain. So just glad to see myself as part of a population getting targeted. So psyched.
We think that.
So I guess,
sorry, go ahead. Yeah, we think that that there's a lot of potential, and we want to push the envelope in other areas, and think that's a really good place for us to play for right now.
So I want to rewind the tape. I pulled up your LinkedIn page, and we chatted about your background a little bit before. Bunch of biotech experience. I'm from the Northeast originally, and I would see this Genzyme building all the time. We would talk about Genzyme.
Yeah.
I haven't heard much about Genzyme lately, but I remember them being like one of the biggest biotechs ever.
It was a really, really great start. It was Henry Tamir was the CEO for a long, long time. And maybe part of the reason you don't hear a lot about it is the company ultimately got sold to Sanofi for over $22 billion a while back. But, Henry started building that company way back in the early 80s, if you can envision that, right? So that was a few decades back, to say the least. We were kind of working out of some really very, low cost space in One Kendall Square, which you're probably really familiar with there in Cambridge. And he was working on these orphan diseases in a very specific space called lysosomal storage disorders. The lead drug was for Gaucher's disease, but really fantastic. It was an enzyme replacement therapy, a great way to kind of cut my teeth, especially in terms of launching product, in these interesting, spaces. So I was, thrilled to be able to work with the company, spent a lot of, time there in Boston, and also then overseas with them in Asia, helping launch the drug in Japan, China, Korea, Hong Kong, a couple other markets as well. So yeah, really great place. Henry, God bless his soul. He passed a few years back, unfortunately, but really fantastic culture, great company, and really groundbreaking in terms of what they did to help patients, which is something I think that we can do, here with Tryp, with psychedelic drugs.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've got like a tremendous resume, Wharton, Penn. Well, actually, I'm confused here. So Wharton is Penn. This is the funny thing about Pennsylvania Ivy Leagues. I always get tripped up.
Yep.
But that's lovely. So your MBA there, and you're bringing in a lot of rigor and awesome experience, which I have to say, not necessarily everybody has that coming into the space as a leader.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
kind of
Appreciate
awesome to
that.
see.
Yeah, kind of went through the paces. Yeah, Wharton is the business school there at the University of Pennsylvania, and did that degree, and then did another degree in international studies, also through the University of Pennsylvania. It was a joint degree, and yeah, great program. Of course, they've got a great medical school, as well, and so it was a good training ground to kind of get ready to launch. Some time in the biotech space, and of course, even since then, boy, I mean, talk about the education you get. I like to kind of consider myself the other kind of PhD, poor, hungry, and driven. And man, when you're working in early biotech companies, you get schooled off in a lot of different ways. There's a lot to learn, but I find all the different aspects of the science, the regulatory, platforms you got to work through, the FDA, of course, clinical trial design, clinical studies, all the animal preclinical work that goes into that, as well as all the different disease states, biologic pathways, different chemistry. There is so much to wrap your head around. It's a lifetime of learning, but it makes it really exciting. And frankly, at the end of the day, like, what better way to spend your time? Better, more than helping patients, helping people, get better, save lives, things like that, right? It's pretty. You kind of feel like at the end of the day, you've done some good, which is really terrific.
Yeah, adding zeros to your bank account's awesome, but there's limits, right? It's like if you didn't actually make a difference, like, does it really feel that fulfilling?
Yeah, for sure.
Not always.
Yeah, for
I
sure.
suppose it depends on the individual too, but yeah, it's definitely a big deal to make an impact on folks. So coming into Tryp, 25 years experience, perhaps there was something that triggered this. Was it this conversation you had with some of these military gentlemen?
Yeah, sort of along my way, a couple things, like, just the timing hit right. A couple things kind of came together. One of the things, yeah, as we were talking on our call before we kind of got on this recording, I had an opportunity to work with a number of former Navy SEALs. Of course, I'm down here in Southern California. San Diego's got one of the significant training bases, and of course, we've got SEALs all over, which is fantastic, and they do really great work, obviously. But there was a project I was working on unrelated to the military industrial kind of complex, but in the healthcare space, actually, interestingly enough. And a bunch of them, of course, they had tours of duty, really sharp people, hardworking individuals, right? And many of them came back after their tours of duty with PTSD, depression, other kind of issues they're trying to deal with. And almost every single one of them had used 5-MeO-DMT to resolve those issues. And at the time, this is several years back, I was thinking to myself, what is 5-MeO-DMT, right? But these guys, talked about their experiences. Typically, they had to go to Mexico, or they were going up to Berkeley, kind of doing this a little bit underground, honestly. But they were, using that very powerful psychedelic to rewire their neural pathways, right, and resolve these issues that they had been carrying for years after their time of service. And the stories I told were just phenomenal, right? So I kind of just wedged that in the back of my mind and just thought to myself, wow, that's a really pretty interesting body of chemistry. I got to check this out. And along the way, I bumped into the founder of Tryp, or one of the founders, that is, and he and I go way back about 20 years or so. We typically get together at the annual JP Morgan Healthcare Conference, which I think is getting rebranded as Healthcare Week, by the way. And that typically happens in January every year. And Bill and I would get together almost always on Thursday at the very end of the week at La Scala to grab a quick little breakfast and to sort of recap our week, which is usually pretty intense. You're sort of chock-a-block, 15, 20 meetings a day. And we'd sort of like just sit down over breakfast the last day and just compare notes, basically, right? And so he had started Tryp. We had a conversation almost about a year ago, actually, this time, about Tryp, what they were doing, his desire to round out the board, expand the board. And so I joined in January on the board of directors, stepped in as chair in February, and then stepped in full-time as CEO in April. And it's just been, just a whirlwind of activity ever since. But it was kind of nice to see these two pieces, kind of come together. I was just very excited about the opportunity to get involved with a company that I think could really make a significant difference to a wide variety of patients.
So at the 2017 MAPS conference in Oakland, I have a kind of fan art poster right there.
Yes.
Dr. Stanislav Grof was on stage delivering the first keynote, and he said the most bold statement. He loves to make bold, controversial statements. 5-MeO DMT is the future of psychiatry. And
Okay.
I was not there. I still haven't watched the video somehow.
Yeah.
I feel kind of like absurd for not having watched that yet. But there's a lot of hope there. Like when we hear all these testimonials, we have to do something with them. Yeah. So
Yeah,
I'm
for
glad
sure.
like that's kind of what you've bumped into. I find it to be one of the weirder, stranger of all of these psychedelic compounds. It's call it atypical, not classical. Um,
Yes, agreed.
in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah, I
And
was
the
having.
only major issue I have with the scene is that people are going out and like harvesting somewhat endangered, if not threatened, species to go use it when they could. We sell a T-shirt that says "Squeeze a chemist, not a toad." To
Right,
like,
there you go. Yes, right,
let's stop hurting
exactly.
nature, please. You're
Yeah,
breaking the law either way. Let's just do it in a way that doesn't hurt nature as much and
yeah,
keep
there
our
you go. Yeah, I
biosphere
mean,
healthy,
it's
right?
part of the reason that we're using synthetics at Trip, and yeah, kind of agreed. I mean, besides the fact, you're helping out, Mother Nature a little bit, but you make this in a lab, and it's a lot more consistent. The FDA is a little bit more comfortable
Way
with
safer
it.
dosing profile.
They for the
In
yeah,
natural source, it's like plus minus 30 to 50 or something percent.
yes, yeah. You
It's
really don't
insane.
know exactly what you're getting, and you don't know what else is in that mixture. You can control for purity and consistency, and amongst a number of different things you can kind of measure when you're going through a rigorous, kind of traditional pharmaceutical manufacturing process,
Totally.
for sure. But yeah, I mean, it is interesting of the whole bag of different chemistries, right? DMT is sort of interesting. I was having dinner up in San Francisco with one of our collaborators, and he was talking about he kind of characterized DMT as being the sledgehammer in the toolkit, right? Like that's the real heavy hammer that you got to take out in certain cases. But the other challenge is that it's very spiky. You can kind of mimic apparently this a psilocybin curve by multiple doses of DMT. But boy, that sounds like a whole lot of work from the physician's perspective. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the whole field, right? And how many different, how many chemistries emerge and which ones kind of work best in certain
Mm-hmm.
applications. We're very focused on psilocybin and its derivatives, primarily because there's so much history, right? Like you said, there's this anecdotal, body of evidence. All these people have used it, tried it, are seeing great results. We've seen, modest size academic studies over the year. I mean, it's actually quite amazing when you go back and look at what was going on in the 40s, well, 50s and 60s, really mostly, in the early days, and then even sort of beyond. I mean, there's quite a body of evidence of activity, as well as the fact that it's safe and well tolerated. And there's a lot of data to be harvested, there. But yeah, it's
That's one of the lessons from Rick Doblin, right? Like he
for
leveraged a
sure.
massive amount of historical data on MDMA, which is
Yeah,
substantially less threatening than psilocybin at the time, right? And
right.
then was able to work
Yes.
it through to where he is today, which is extraordinary.
Yeah, which is
Um,
yeah, it's fantastic, and I think that he's right, and it's a little bit unfortunate that best I can kind of gather based on the reading I've been doing, from what was happening historically, was that, boy, I mean, I think the Nixon administration kind of really jammed this in a bad way, right? I mean, he sort of associated that administration associated
yeah,
psychedelics with the whole movement against Vietnam and that effort, and he just wanted to shut that down, and anything that the hippies were involved with, he was going to cut down at its knees, and psychedelics are part of
hmm
the carnage of that time, unfortunately. Um, because there was a lot of evidence that these could really these could be great chemistries for certain individuals, right? And boy, like we could use help in all these different therapeutic areas. So,
right.
man, that was
Yeah,
unfortunate, but
in
it's
your background coming from kind of like non-psychiatric med, coming into like a psychiatric type situation, not to characterize pain as psychiatric necessarily, but it's got to be a
right.
really interesting jump for you,
Yeah,
going from like enzymes and,
yeah,
helpful drugs to this weird landscape.
yeah. It's definitely kind of a slightly altered landscape. You're saying compared to some of the other areas I've worked in. I've worked
Mm-hmm.
primarily early enzyme replacement therapy essentially was the platform, biologic platform that Genzyme had in a number of different diseases. My other two companies were in early days in the gene therapy world, and then early days
Mm,
in cancer immunotherapy. So kind of the bulk of my
awesome.
work was in those three areas. So three pretty broad buckets of drug development, and certainly the big learning curves for all of them. This is obviously now a fourth for me, although I've had a chance to see a lot of the companies at this startup accelerator that I was CEO of, and as well as the venture fund that I worked at, that I put together with our current CFO, Luke Hayes. But going deep into this topic, it's fascinating, right? Because you got some elements that are, really, there's a lot of familiarity in terms of, like, dealing with the FDA and INDs and clinical trial design and manufacturing and things like that. There's a lot of stuff that kind of like there's overlap, but then there's things, in this space where you've got obviously new chemistry, and like you said, it's all, different receptors, different things that happen because of, hitting these receptors. And then you also, you couple this with psychotherapy. So, you got that element, as well. So there's definitely, it's been a little bit of a learning curve, but at the end of the day, there's enough similarities. And frankly, I love getting involved in stories at this point that are really just kind of emerging, because frankly, I think that's where you can create so much value for patients. But, yeah, it's a fascinating field, no doubt. Yeah, there's a lot to be learned, and still a lot more questions, frankly, than answers. That's the thing that's really quite surprising. I mean, yeah, I've been on a learning curve. Like I got right to the edge fast, right? Because I realized, oh shit, like nobody has the answers to these questions, because it hasn't been around that long, and the more you sort of,
like Nixon. Thank you, Nixon, and the drug war for making us have bad science at this point, like
right, exactly.
immature science, I guess.
For sure. I mean, the funding just drops, right? When these got labeled as Schedule 1. I'm sure there was a conversation one day when somebody in his administration came in and said, "Sir, I think I know how to take care of this hippie problem that you have with the Vietnam War. Let's go get let's get psychedelics scheduled as Schedule 1 through this group called the DEA," which he probably didn't even know what it was at the time. And that's sort of what happened. And they shut down all the funding, right? As we've all, kind of now read. And that all that data just got kind of literally shelved. But, fortunately, it's been picked up now, kind of quietly by academics. Also, of course, there's practitioners. And it turns out there's a lot of people that were kind of working on both sides of the fence. They're academicians, during the day. And, it's kind of a bit of a side hustle. They're doing sessions with patients just because they realize there's so much benefit, right? And that sort of kept the momentum going. And then now you've got, a few more clinical studies that have been done by academic institutions. You've got a lot of anecdotal stories of individuals who have used these treatments in different publications and stuff. So that's all now kind of coalescing again for, I think, a really significant wave of, what hopefully then, pushes this, into the commercial markets.
Right. Yeah. A really great book to understand the history of the drug war is Johan Hari's Chasing the Scream.
Yes.
And I just recommend people follow up, like track down and understand the drug war. It's such a big and ugly piece of our history as Americans. So that shift happened at the end of Prohibition. All those guys needed jobs, so they kind of pulled some deals to like, oh, let's start up the DEA and go after other stuff now that we don't have alcohol to go after. So kind of the same kind of scam that the DEA is pulling now. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. Next.
Yes.
So, how do you characterize? So you're going after an eating disorder, which we can roughly call a psychiatric disorder. How do you categorize pain? Like more neurological, or how do you discuss that different?
It's a great question, right? And this is also, kind of one of the exciting things, for me, in terms of like where we are with the state of understanding of pain, right? So we're working with Dan Claw, among other people, who's at the University of Michigan. Dan was one of the leading researchers, and is actually in the field of treatment of fibromyalgia, right? So he's got this great publication that he's put together, where he, maps out the three different categories of pain, right? And it's nociceptive pain, which is, kind of a little more classic pain. It's caused by damage to the sensory nerves. Neuropathic pain, and then what's known as nociplastic pain. And nociplastic pain is the very specific type of pain that we're going after, where there's no physical ailment. There's nothing the doctor can kind of point to. There's not nerve damage specifically, but literally the pain signal is coming out of the central nervous system, or literally out of the patient's mind, right? And it's just got there's just a miswiring of the neural network to an extent that there's this constant pain signal that can't get shut down. And so clearly it's got a very mental, component to it, although it's not necessarily, these diseases aren't considered mental diseases per se, but they really have a strong mental component to them, just like depression and PTSD and anxiety and other things as well. So there's a common thread there for sure, which of course then drives the rationale to use a psychedelic and use the neuroplastic effects of a psychedelic to help, rewire the brain and hopefully, rewire it to the point that you can shut down that pain signal and lay down some new tracks, as they say, right, to sort of get your brain working more effectively.
Now, does the treatment model you're working on look really different between eating disorders and pain? Like, is it a really different process, or is it kind of similar?
No, it's very consistent across these two broad categories, right? There are some nuances in some of the sub indications that we're going after. So, of course, we couple, like all companies, we're coupling the therapeutic treatment along with psychotherapy, right? And the psychotherapy is slightly different from indication to indication, and a big part of that, frankly, is the intent that patients bring into their sessions, for one, and then also the post integration session. So it's prep sessions, of course, monitoring when the patients are dosed with the psychedelic drug, so they're safe and comfortable and all that. And then there's the post treatment integration sessions where a lot of the magic really kind of comes to fruition. So that training manual that we put together, sort of that style of our psychotherapy, is a little bit unique, but it is consistent, overall, in that we're coupling treatment along with psychotherapy. Typically, in one, we're thinking maybe 2 dose sessions that are probably going to be episodic, so that you treat patients hopefully once a year, maybe possibly twice a year. We're not quite sure yet. It's one of those unknown questions, but yeah, it's going to be a similar type of treatment modality overall, because there's a lot of similarities in terms of trying to essentially fix how patients relate to the pain, or in the case of eating disorders, how they relate to food. So there's definitely a lot of similarities between how we're going to work and how other companies are operating right now.
That's awesome. Are you like, so you say psilocybin and derivatives? I assume that means things beyond just things like psilocin. It would be like a bunch of kind of slightly novel molecules based on psilocybin.
It's interesting, chemistry, right? So of course, psilocybin is a prodrug, and psilocin is the active, ingredient in that pairing. And so we think there's a lot of interesting innovation to be had around that combination, and actually how you utilize psilocybin and psilocin and so forth, as well as creating some, using unique excipients or using unique salts and coformers around that base chemistry to make it much more stable and get it to work a lot better in the very particular type of route of administration that we're thinking about. But those derivatives are closely related to psilocybin and psilocin. We're not straying too far from that right now. Part of our strategy is to go into the clinic with an off-the-shelf oral version of the chemistry, right? To literally just give us a thumbs up, thumbs down read. Do we have activity or not in these really unique therapeutic areas? And we're moving quickly into the clinic right now. We just actually got word today from the FDA that we've got clearance now to start our study in fibromyalgia with the University of Michigan, which we're thrilled about. And we've got 4 other studies on the heels of that in these 4 different other areas of phantom limb pain, complex regional pain syndrome, binge eating disorder, and hypothalamic obesity, which we can get into later if you'd like to. But we've got those 5 phase 2A trials, teed up and that we're working on. And then as soon as we get a confirmatory read, then we're going to work and take our novel formulation and our novel route of administration, take that forward to be the commercial product that we, hopefully ultimately get approval for and sell. But we think that there's a lot of room around trying to improve what the patient experience is like. Right now, there's a lot of data showing that some patients never get in the psychedelic space. Other patients will they'll have a trip for 10 hours, which is really a problem, right? To have a couple therapists in a session for 10 hours and so forth, and try to manage that whole process, right? So we think that there's a lot to be had there to make a much more consistent experience. We also think that theoretically there might be some ways to better control how deep patients go into their subconscious and how long they're in their subconscious. And we think our particular route of administration could facilitate that. So we think there's a lot of, kind of much more traditional kind of pharmaceutical type of work around the dose regimen, patient experience, safety, frankly. We also think we have an ability to shut down a bad trip if patients have a bad experience with our particular route. All of that you can't really, do right now, with an oral tablet. You drop a pill and you're literally along for the ride, and there's nothing you can do for the most part, other than maybe get the patient a bit of an anecdote. Or an antidote, that is, sorry. So that's, yeah. So we think there's a lot to be done to really refine that experience for patients with a novel chemistry. But yeah, most of it's right. It's very in the wheelhouse of psilocin and psilocybin.
Outstanding. Yeah, I think psilocin and things close to it, especially shorter acting molecules, are going to be highly valuable in clinic. Like LSD is lovely. It's just highly promiscuous and lasts far too long for a lot of these cases, right? Especially to make it practical to implement into our existing systems. So all about that. Like the shorter acting tryptamines are something I'm wildly excited about.
Yeah.
Can't wait to get my hands on some, but we'll get there later, years later, I'm sure. But route of administration, can you speak to that at all, or is it proprietary at this point?
Yeah, we've been pretty quiet about that thus far. We still got a little bit of work that we're doing around finalizing certain experiments so that we can be in a position to file IP, right? So we can then fully disclose that. But let me give you a little, kind of flavor, kind of beyond what I've already mentioned, which is, first of all, like I was saying, we're trying to solve for some of these basic questions around how to make a much more consistent experience for patients. The other thing I can say is that you can envision a lot of different ways to deliver chemistries, to us as patients, right, or to patients, that is. And so there's things like intravenous formulations of things. There's subcutaneous and intermuscular injections, right? So we've heard a lot about that. That's what vaccines are, for example, right? You can think of a nasal formulation, an inhaled formulation, right, directly into lungs, which is really powerful and can, very, very fast acting. You can have kind of slow release patches, right, which is, another whole nother category. But there's a good half a dozen plus ways to deliver chemistries to human beings and human subjects, right? And of that category of fairly standard types of delivery methodologies, there's a couple that we're pretty excited about, and one in particular that we think will have a lot of utility in this particular setting with these types of patients. So we focus most of our work around this one particular route, and then a formulation that can help us solve some of the stability challenges you have with this chemistry, as well as making it really suitable for that particular route of administration. So the coupling of those two things together, we think, provides a really much more consistent experience, like I was saying, and also potentially another kind of safety outlet for patients if they have a bad experience. So that's what we can say right now. We'll be in a position, we anticipate, in call it the next 3-4 months, where we can describe in much more detail in terms of specifically what we're doing with that route.
Outstanding. Yeah, would love to hear that. Please let us know when it's shareable.
For sure. Yeah, happy to.
I love all the novel routes of administration. There's so much interesting stuff happening. Can't wait to learn more. And yeah, like these things, there's so much room for like downstream implications. Like once you get this tech going, like what other applications might be available for this? And long and short, probably a ton. But we have to get through phase 3 first, right? Before we can really do that.
It's a really great train of thought, right? I mean, there's certainly there are more indications that you can go into than we can sort of get to at the moment. Even as an industry, right? But I think you're beginning to see it, right? More and more, you've got companies, going into smoking cessation, alcohol addiction, alcohol use disorders, things like that, right? Recently I was talking to a company about cancer-related distress. There's obviously cancer pain. In the areas that we're looking at specifically in chronic pain and eating disorders, there's probably another dozen or so areas of this category of what's called nociplastic pain that we can go after, right? So TMJ, for example, certain forms of arthritis, tinnitus, and certain forms of that. We think all could potentially, be areas of therapeutic areas where we could potentially, run clinical studies and provide utility. And then in the eating disorders, area, we're focused on these a little bit lesser known spaces for right now, and HO, or hypothalamic obesity, and binge eating disorder. But there's a wide variety of others, of course, that people are aware of that we think that we could potentially, move our drug development programs into. So there's more than enough to go after, for sure. We're already excited about these 5 areas that we've identified as kind of our initial areas of focus. One, because the numbers of patients they're just huge, right? So if you look, for example, at fibromyalgia, there's over 4 million patients that are afflicted by this in the United States alone right now. And it probably, and that's along with phantom limb, CRPS, and binge eating. Each one of those is, a blockbuster, market opportunity with, thousands and thousands of people impacted. So we think there's a lot to go after there, and certainly other things, beyond that as well, at some point. So in due course, as we begin to generate more data, and continue to spread our wings with other academic, collaborators and collaborations, then we think we'll be in a position to potentially expand that list of work that we're doing.
That's outstanding. Now, before we comment on the market generally, I want to kind of talk about like the origins of Tryp Therapeutics. Like, who were the founders?
Yeah, so the two founders are Bill Garner and Jim Koo. They've both been around the company for, since the beginning, obviously. They're both on the board of directors, both significant shareholders, both been very active with the company, kind of throughout. So those are the two co-founders. And I think Bill, in particular, has a lot of experience in working, in chemistries where there's new applications, reformulations, areas where he's pulling in, data that's been created in the past that maybe, could be a leg up in terms of moving to the clinic quickly. So there's a lot of elements of this that I think are really similar to kind of, his pattern of company formation in the past. He's had a lot of success in a specific story called Race Oncology as of late, obviously in the oncology, area, another publicly traded company that's done incredibly well, recently after, some years of real hard, work in the clinic and so forth. And I think he's got a really good, kind of sense of where to find, really important inflection points in the overall drug development experience. Both he and Jim are MDs by training, so they've got really good, kind of sense in terms of the medical community, what physicians are facing, these different types of therapeutic, disease states.
Different kinds of MDs, like oncologists, or what was their focus before? Do you know?
Yes, yeah, they're both they're both unique in terms of their training. Bill was a pathologist initially. Jim's got more expertise in cardiovascular disease, amongst other areas. But they both come to the space from one area, which is one of the interesting things, and the great things about most physicians. My father was a physician as well, and so I had a lot of time with him, and also my uncle and aunt who were also in the medical community. And they all have a very strong broad base, at least in my experience, of healthcare, and then they've got some very narrowly defined specialties. But those tools that they bring to the table with this broad base of understanding of healthcare and treating patients really is quite helpful, regardless of what their what their specialty area of training was in the past.
Outstanding, yeah. And were you partnered with a VC to launch this thing, or how did you guys how was it kicked off before you jumped in?
Yeah, it was really privately funded, of course, as you mentioned, not with any institutional money. It was a lot of kind of the co-founders money, as well as some retail and other family office money that really got this started. The company decided to go public on the Canadian Stock Exchange relatively early in the process. The company's been around for about only 2 years, which is really quite amazing. It's made a tremendous amount of progress in that short period of time. Company went public literally a year ago, raised a small amount of capital from the Canadian markets, and has raised a little bit of capital, since then. And we've got a lot of ambition and desire to move and start trading into the NASDAQ in the United States and begin to tap into larger pools of capital in the more kind of traditional, institutional life science kind of arena, where we're getting, we've had a lot of traction, a lot of conversations with funds that are, one either specifically focused on psychedelic drug development, and other kind of more traditional life science biotech funds that are, kind of sniffing around a little bit, looking at this scene, trying to figure out when they want to participate, when it might make sense to get involved. I don't think any of them are writing big checks yet, but there's definitely, as you know very well,
they've got to be watching.
Yeah, they're kind of watching. But there's been a few, like OrbiMed, we know, has come in a bit. We know RA Capital's been kind of sniffed around. Deerfield's gotten involved in a couple stories. We also know that partners at certain funds, so their day job is at a significant fund, say like a BlackRock or Citadel or SoftBank, for example. And these guys and gals have pulled together, small amounts of capital to invest in the psychedelic space because, frankly, they're pretty excited about what it can
Oh,
mean.
that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So like kind of their own private side hustle fund. That's kind of
Exactly.
interesting.
Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. And then a lot of psychedelic funds, as have kind of popped up. They've got, 10 to $50 million or so, it seems, and some a little bit more than that, which is great. And they're expanding and adding more capital. And so, that's where, I think that that's kind of where we're headed and what we're working to pursue is tapping those sources of capital and ultimately, hopefully getting pharma interested in this space as well, which I think will happen. Clearly, J&J has been interested since they've been working in ketamine now for a while. And that will, as we see more larger controlled studies presented with data like Compass just pushed out, at the Wonderland conference less than a month ago, I think that we're going to see more, pharma companies begin to kind of take a closer look at what's happening here. But yeah, it's pretty exciting for sure. And there's definitely some big money that's sort of looking around at these chemistries.
Can you give us any kind of like reaction to the Compass news that came out? Like, what was that? Early November. It's kind of it was received poorly, but really, I don't think it was that bad. That's my gut
Yeah,
response.
there's a lot of people have commented on already. I was having lunch with Robin Carhart Harris, and he was just a couple weeks before that, and he was, he's pretty close to that company, and obviously he didn't tell me anything that was confidential at that time. But he had said that he would, likely be, looking at that data and possibly commenting. It turns out that he ended up, commenting on it, and it made some great, he had some, pretty good view. But my personal view, was that it was fantastic data, right? I mean, first and foremost, like they got a trial completed with 233 patients, in a blind controlled, study, which was fantastic. They obviously used 1 milligram dose as kind of the control, and then they had the 10 milligram and the 25 milligram doses alongside that. So 3 doses, very robust design, 200 plus patients, right, over a pretty significant period of time, and a really important indication of treatment resistant depression, right? So one, they got the trial done, and then
Hmm.
second of all, when you start to take a look at, and all we've seen, so far pretty much is high level data, but a lot more activity in the 25 milligram dose than in the 10 or the 1, right? So they really clarified that 25 milligrams is the right, dose for those patients, which was great. There were some, side effects, but a lot of the side effects seemed to me to be things that would be pretty consistent with patients with that category of disease regardless, right? So that was sort of an interesting thing for me to see is how they were sort of characterizing certain side effects.
I thought
You
it
know,
was just basic human experience. Like, I didn't even think it needed to be a depressed, like a clinically depressed person. I'm like, this is kind of, like suicidal ideation happens
yes,
for, as far as I'm
right,
concerned, every human at least a couple
yes,
times, if not, twice a year for your
right,
whole
yeah,
life.
yeah, exactly. And then if you've got treatment resistant depression, like you've got that going on anyway. So I to call that a side effect, I thought was like that just was a big question mark for me, and I, can't comment on what the FDA is going to say about that, but I'm kind of curious of what they do on a go forward basis, right? But that I totally
Hmm.
agree. It just seemed like, well, that's the natural course. And so that was interesting. And then, they also talked about the dropout rates, and that dropout rate was inversely correlated to the level of the dose. So, in other words, they had more people drop out in the 1 milligram dose than they did the 25. And my guess, and it was completely linear, right? There was like a whole bunch of people, a good handful or more that dropped out. The 1 milligram dose, it was less dropouts in the 10 milligram dose, and fewer even than that in the 25 milligram dose. And I think it was pretty clear what was going on, that like patients knew, right? They knew if they had the active, an active dose or
Yeah.
not. And if they're in the 1 milligram, they're just saying like, no way, man, like I'm dropping out because I didn't get the goods, right? I didn't get enough of a dose to put me in a psychedelic state. And I think people, people that are kind of aware and that maybe had tried this at some point, they knew that. And I think they just dropped out is my
Mhm.
personal view. I could be wrong, but that's, I think, what was going on with that. But I thought that was a really good trend as well, because that speaks, that speaks quite well. But to see double the effect in the 25 milligram, arm, I thought was really significant. And then, like you said, yeah, I mean, the market's response was like, wow, they whacked the share price by 40%. I was thinking, okay, like I get it, right? Like in biotech and drug development, generally, you buy the news and or you buy the rumor, sell the news, right? Is typically the adage. But boy, that seemed pretty aggressive, right? They had a pretty significant run up, and then they just get kind of shot down pretty assertively. But if you sort of look at the trading, now it seems to be kind of beginning to step up a bit, which is good. I think ultimately the market's going to realize that that was a great step forward. Frankly, not only for Compass but for the whole industry. So I thought that was a really great benchmark study for all of us to strive to achieve for in the future.
Yeah. And how do you like? My read is that it seems like most people involved from the investment side, well, maybe the loudest people involved in the investment side, don't totally understand biotech to the same degree they probably should in order to be, commenting, rumoring like, oh, none of this is ever going to make it. But, like biotech, like we were talking about before, it takes a lot of time and a lot of capital to work your way through this whole process, right? It's
Yeah,
kind of a
for
big
sure.
gamble, but it's like an informed gamble. Like you and a number of other smart people said, these are the moves we're going to make.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, we were talking about like you mentioned this, I think, right in our session, a little pre-session before we got going, and I think you're spot on, right? Like this is we're doing this for the long game, right? Like this is not a short sprint. This is it's a marathon for sure, maybe an ultra marathon, and you got to make certain moves, but you're getting a lot of signals along the way, right? In terms of if you're on track, or not. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think there's going to be a lot more talent that comes in, to the industry overall. I mean, look, I think it's fantastic that we've got people that are starting funds, and maybe they've got experiences from other sectors. Maybe they were in cannabis before, but they've obviously been successful. They've been successful to raise money from limited partners, which is a huge feat in and of itself. So God bless them for doing that heavy lifting and bringing that capital here. And hopefully what happens is we all learn a little bit more and we all, begin to kind of nudge our way towards bringing these compounds to market, which I think is, that's what's happening. And look, there's a lot of stuff that still needs to be sorted out for sure. And there'll be separation between the groups that are, know what they're doing and being really efficient about getting to important clinical endpoints, navigating through the FDA even. I mean, just like for us today, getting this formal announcement from the FDA that we'd cleared the hurdle to start our study, look, I mean, it wasn't, it was a significant milestone for us for sure, just to get through that space. Now, it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
as interesting as having data, right, in that patient population. But boy, just, that's sort of that's the ring the bell kind of day. But, for
Right.
sure, this like little milestone along the way of getting the FDA's buy-in, I can tell you behind the scenes, man, there was a lot of work that went into that protocol, the investigator brochure, the informed consent, which
Mm-hmm.
patients have to sign, of course, right? All that stuff, navigating the different instruments that we're going to use, the questionnaires, right, that we'll be looking at, trying to figure out, how many doses, which dose. There's just a lot of
Mm-hmm.
detail that goes into any protocol, and then you got to get that through the agency, and they've got to, buy into it. So that's a lot of effort. So kudos to our academic collaborators and anybody who frankly does that. But it's just it's one step and an important kind of milestone. So you just keep forging away, hitting those critical milestones, knowing that you've got a good eye around the long term path of how to bring compound to market.
Mm. Yeah, like everybody's Sunday at Wonderland kind of was upset because they saw. I thought it was so. Well, not Sunday. I guess that was Tuesday, right? The
Yes.
results were
Yeah.
released, I think,
Right.
early Tuesday morning, maybe the 7th or 8th or
Yes.
whatever that day was. And
Yes.
then,
Yeah.
yeah, it was fascinating. I had so many conversations with people about Compass, more than I ever expected to have. Um,
Right. Yeah.
you
Well,
know,
I think we were all anticipating that, we all had kind of a hunch that was, going to be a good study, and it was, and we were all hoping that it would be, be positive data, which it was. But I think we were also hoping that might be a watershed event for the whole industry, and that the market would sort of reward them for that good data, and it might slosh over to the rest of us, right? And it wasn't that,
mhm.
at all. So yeah, that was a little bit challenging for sure. But I think that the market eventually will sort this out, and I think they'll begin to realize the value that's getting created. and the other companies are creating value, as well. So you just got to keep at it, right? I mean, for sure, I was getting the same kind of thing. A lot of people are really frustrated with the equity markets right now. A lot of CEOs kind of licking their wounds after being, beaten up by their boards and so forth around how challenging, it's been, and how volatile the markets have been and how low their market caps are. I think that's been, top of mind for like every single CEO and CFO out there right now. But you forge on, and you realize that markets have their whims, and certain things are in favor and then out of favor over during certain cycles, and you just sort of keep working your way through. I think the other thing maybe that's going on is that a lot of the early money that got into psychedelics really came out of kind of the crypto cannabis space. And I think maybe people were anticipating, and investors were thinking that this is going to be kind of a quick quick return. And it's not really the same exactly, certainly not the same as crypto, although both those industries took a long time to mature. We think there's a great example in the cannabis space with GW Pharma. A good friend of mine, Justin Gover, has been at that company, or was at the company now for 20 some odd years, and they were just really going stepwise for a long time along the way, and then ultimately, they got.
Did GW bring Marinol forward, or were they doing CBD related stuff?
It was out of the cannabinoid family. It was a drug they called Epidiolex for pediatric epilepsy. So it was, cannabinoid family synthesized, going down kind of a traditional pharmaceutical drug development pathway for this, unique therapeutic area. So that's what they were working on. But it was
right on. Yeah, so it's kind of like an FDA approved CBD type deal. That's kind of awesome. Yeah, I just pulled up the page here.
Yeah, exactly. So they went, precise. Yeah, exactly. So they had. I remember talking. Actually, I had them in front of a group of people. Had another situation where he presented his he was in phase 3 at that time, and then a few months later he had positive phase 3 data, and their market cap doubled, and then he launched it. Justin and I kind of had several different conversations over the time period, and he was like now 2.5 years or so, maybe 3 years into his launch, and Jazz Pharmaceuticals came along and scooped him up for $7.2 billion dollars after all that work. But it's a great kind of potential benchmark in terms of what we could do. I think here in this sector, we'll see. It's obviously a different chemistry, slightly different way you deliver it, and you've got to deal with psychotherapy as well. But I think that it's a great example of how these naturally derived compounds, actually, there's a lot of value in using the kind of that baseline data that Mother Nature has kind of helped create to then migrate into a more traditional pharmaceutical type of drug development strategy.
Yeah. So this is a nice transition, really, because so we see Epidiolex, GW Pharma, then we see Charlotte's Web, right? Charlotte's Web kind of really owned that story around CBD for seizures, and kind of like whole plant industrial CBD, still charging wildly premium prices. I've never bought one because it's so expensive, of Charlotte's Web. CBD generally is. But it's also, CBD is not covered by insurance companies. I'm sure Epidiolex, if you have medical, like healthcare insurance, you're going to get a prescription for Epidiolex if you qualify with the right criteria, right?
Right.
And this is like a really confusing thing for a lot of folks in the psychedelic scene, because it never really stopped. Like, it got more scary for decades, but there was never really an interrupt, right? Kind of, but not really. And obviously there's a lot of value in getting a group like the FDA to approve your thing, saying it's safe and yes, it works for these indications and whatnot. But do you have any kind of like advice for how the community might want to think about this? Because, a lot of people are just like psyched on mushrooms or LSD or whatever it is, or ayahuasca. And, like they're all like, why do we need pharmas? It's like, well, we need evidence, and the feds aren't providing us funding to get evidence. So like pharma is doing it for us. And, I kind of classify groups like yours as small cap pharma right now. I don't know if that's the right phrasing, but, early stage biotech, maybe.
That's a great, both those are good ways to describe it. Yeah. Early stage biotechs. Yeah. Small public pharma for sure. Yeah. Probably early stage biotech, but yeah, that's a great way to describe it. But you're right. I mean, you're spot on, right? Like, I think that, pharma, broadly, the capital markets that are around right now are going to, fund these, companies like Tryp to generate data so that we can actually get these chemistries through the FDA and get formal, new drug application approvals or NDA approvals. which then will allow doctors to write prescriptions, right? For one thing. And then second of all, that will be the evidence that payers need, right? So I think that's the other thing that people haven't quite thought through exactly, although there's some conversations, of course, and amongst the circles of leaders, in these bigger companies and others, we're all thinking about how are we going to get this paid for? And of course, that's going to ultimately be a question of efficacy, data efficacy and safety, of course, and then convincing these insurance companies, the payers, that this is worthy of being covered, and having proper reimbursement codes. So the reimbursement component is a critical part of the marketing strategy. And yeah, there's going to still be an element of people that grow and harvest and use
right. You can't
plant-based.
make mushrooms more illegal, and they're wildly cheap to manufacture. And in Canada, I'm told there's so many being grown right now that the cost is near zero for mushrooms.
Wow.
So it's like, there's a limited actual profitable market there.
Right. You're not going to make
for
money
now.
growing. Yes. Right. Which is what happened in the cannabis space, right? Like the growing.
Right. I'm seeing that with a lot of my friends in Colorado now. They're like,
yes.
How do we make money anymore?
Right. Because there's something, I think that the stat I heard was there's 30 times more cannabis being produced than there's actually being consumed right now. Right. So, oops, like we kind of like the market's got to get, the different components have to be scaled to the right level. And that part of the supply chain got way overbuilt, unfortunately. Right. But anyway, I mean, there's going to be that. There's going to be there'll probably be a role, and there are going to be certain people. I mean, I've had a lot of acquaintances that have had personal experiences with plant-based psychedelics, and those experiences, by the way, have generally been good, which is great to hear. I would be a little bit concerned about doing something that I didn't really understand. Like where was it derived, and what's actually in that mixture that I'm eating or drinking, right? But knock on wood, so far those experiences have been good, and there's a lot of people that
a lot of
have
value for safe supply. Like we don't understand our supply right now because of the drug war, and
exactly.
fortunately and unfortunately, groups like yours are going to bring us a safe supply to a certain degree that
Exactly.
we haven't had to date.
Yeah, I mean, we went straight into two traditional life biotech contract manufacturing groups and said, hey, make this chemistry, right? And they said, sure, we can make that. And like you said, so they squeezed the chemist, right? And they manufactured the product, and there's a process, and we know that it's all written down. There's protocols, there's SOPs and all that, right? It's all documented, and we know it's consistent every single time they make it. And then we've got, all that downstream work that's being done in the formulation, and all that, gets, that paperwork gets all fed into the FDA, and the FDA can look at it, and they know that what's being delivered to patients is very, very consistent. So I think that really makes it a scalable, business, and we can reach a lot more people. So I think that's the biggest message. The way I kind of look at it is that the thing about synthetic is that it just allows you, not only to have consistency and all that we were just talking about, but it allows you to scale so you can impact so many other people's lives, right? So it is, a little bit of a pain in the backside to kind of go through this process. And I can totally get why certain people are saying, hey, why do we need the pharma industry to do this? But on the other hand, if life science investors and biotech and pharma companies do get involved and push this through to market, boy, you're going to be able to, treat so many more patients because you have such a broader platform and supply chain, reliable supply chain, like you're saying, to support the industry.
Right.
And then you got physicians who have data, who are comfortable in writing prescriptions, not worried about getting sued for off-label use. And then you've also got hopefully the insurance companies and other payers in a position where they're willing to pay for the use of these drugs. Which I mean, I've heard of people paying $5,000 for sessions, right? Like, boy, I mean, I'm sure if you're
and it goes up from there too. Like that's it's incredible what needs to be charged. Like confession. Yeah. People know about this. Like I did 3 sessions legally in Jamaica with people, and having to travel there, get hotels, and all this other bullshit. The pricing was not great. I have to be honest. And I don't think I really even made money after 3 people charging a high ticket. It's really sucked. I'm hoping to figure all that out.
Well, let me know what you find. I haven't done a whole lot of market research on that particular angle, so I'm curious. Let me know what you find out. But for sure, having it paid for from your insurance company and having a doctor write a prescription, right, for a session, boy, that's going to really open up the floodgates in terms of the numbers of people that you can support. So that's a big plus for this, kind of using an industrial type of platform. And I get there's kind of some drawbacks and a little bit of pushback on that, but I think at the end of the day, watching these two kind of worlds come together. I mean, that was one of the great things about being in Miami, there live and in person, is that, it's a really diverse community and set of players. I think there's room for everybody and there's a role for everybody. But we're all going to need to figure out how to come together in the right way to have the biggest impact. And I think, it's all going to get sorted out in due course, no problem. And I'm just pretty excited to watch it, watch it unfold and be a part of it in a small way.
Yeah, I generally agree. Like we've got to figure out how to coexist. Like there's so much like seemingly inappropriate animosity. Like that's my read. A lot of people think it's appropriate animosity, but I'm like, you got to factor in so many things. This is not a simple story, and we have to deliver. How do we get prescription psilocybin related compounds to housewives and middle America and Ohio, etc.
Right.
And it's through a doctor making the recommendations as opposed to hippie Joe Moore from Colorado kind of saying things.
Yeah.
It's we have to have real data, real professionals that are trusted, that can make the right pitch, right?
I think that's right. I mean, that's kind of, that's certainly our viewpoints and been our perspective. And we're excited to be a part of this as it unfolds. So yeah, it's really exciting days, right ahead of us, and a lot of great, things that will be coming up in the next couple of quarters, I think.
Totally. So, I don't know if this is disclosable, but Rick Doblin kind of, the MAPS model needs really insurance coverage in order for that to be executable, to any reasonable scale, right? Because I forget the pricing, 9,000 to 18, I think was the range, because MAPS isn't going to be setting the price. It's going to be set by the providers, I believe.
Right. Mm-hmm.
There will be a set price for the drug, but that's not going to be the most expensive part, I don't believe. Have you all thought about like what it might look like on the tail end and what might be like the reimbursable sweet spot?
Yeah, we're doing a bunch of analysis right now in terms of looking at the price of currently approved therapeutic drugs, like in the area of fibromyalgia. In the other areas, there's not a whole lot of approved drugs, as well as kind of looking at what psychedelics or what people are charging, for psychedelics, kind of in the black market. Also some of the numbers that you were just describing there. So that's probably there. I think there could be some variability, but I think that people are sensitive, to drug pricing, obviously, as are we, and we want to be, we want to be reasonable. We want to make sure that these drugs are accessible, but we also, realize there's some very expensive components of this, including all the, the like time and
years of R&D,
right? That goes into these things. That's a large part why pharmaceuticals are so expensive to begin with. But yeah, I think it's going to be, in the 20s of thousands of dollars potentially, depending on the indication, possibly. In terms of overall, kind of the rack rate, so to speak. That will kind of depends on how many sessions. Most people are we're looking at this. I think most people are looking at this from the perspective of what does it cost to treat a patient over a year period of time, right? Regardless of how many sessions. So I think it'll be more of a pricing model like that, where it's tied to outcomes sense. As compared to, you're charging per session, because that doesn't really, the per session thing. I guess that's, like a lot of the business models work that way, but ultimately, at the end of the day, we want to treat patients and we want to see that there's a durable effect. So it's really like, what's it going to take to treat a patient over a year period of time? And we think the good news is that very likely we'll be able to show that this is, a treatment that's provided once, maybe twice a year, and it's got a long tail on that durability. And if that's the case, then the prices might be a little bit different. But we're just kind of digging into that right now. We're very focused and heads down on this early research at the moment, but that will need to kind of all come together along with the treatment clinics, and frankly also I think something that Rick has picked up on, which is we're going to need a lot of psychotherapists, right, that are properly trained to treat all these patients. They're going to need their help. So you got that element as well. So a couple different factors to figure out, but I think that the industry is going to move towards that, and MAPS and Compass are going to be kind of on the forefront of that for right now. And I think hopefully at some point Tryp is right on their heels with later stage data in these other therapeutic areas, while we begin to kind of figure out that particular business model in chronic pain and eating disorder. So a lot to look forward to, and still a lot of work to be done. But I think the industry is going to sort this out in due course.
I have no idea why I'm like not asking any questions about eating disorders. I just feel like that's kind of self-explanatory for folks, but maybe it isn't. But I want to go back to pain just for one last deal.
Sure. Yeah.
Are you receiving any kind of like general critiques from like pain researchers generally? Or are they kind of interested, beyond the folks working on your team like Castellanos and Claw?
It's very specific to physicians that are working in these areas of nociplastic pain, right? But they've come out of the woodwork pretty quickly, actually, which has been great. And we'll announce a couple other academic collaborators here relatively soon, and that will kind of reveal a few other players that are around there. So I'd say no, not generally. I don't think that psychedelics are going to be used in the same way that opioids are, right? Which is sort of a general
Totally.
Painkiller, right? Which, by the way, I think that one of the side benefits of bringing a psychedelic to market for nociplastic pain is that we could help alleviate this massive opioid crisis that we're in the middle of here down in the States, right? Which is just horrific.
It's not discussed enough.
Yeah,
I think Tryp and companies looking at this could make a massive dent on,
for sure,
where the feds fell short on punishing Purdue. We have to punch them in the wallet,
Yes, exactly.
Through stuff
100%.
like this.
Yeah, 100%. And that's what this will do. Like, we know that psychedelics are not addictive, even in animal models. Like, animals will not come back for a second dose of a psychedelic. It's just not addictive in any way, right? So that's at least that we know so far. So that's fantastic, and we think it's a very durable effect, unlike these general opioids that are being used for pain. So I'd say no in terms of like everybody sort of like coming out of the woodwork in general pain, but yes to the question of researchers working in nociplastic in these pain signals that are derived out of the central nervous system. Those researchers are definitely, we're getting to, or they're getting to us, and we're pretty excited, to be kind of leading the charge on that front, and hopefully we were able to generate some solid data, on that in these areas, soon. But the idea that you can use a psychedelic and that experience of being in the psychedelic psychedelic state to rewire your brain. I mean, there's a great chart out of one of the publications that we typically refer to that's functional MRI. So one of the things we're doing, by the way, is that we're looking at functional MRI as well as EEG as a couple of measures of brain activity, pre and post treatment, right? So when patients are just walking in the room versus post treatment with a psychedelic, and what happens to their brain waves and that brain activity. We're working to correlate these brain scans to therapeutic outcomes. And hopefully we see a correlation, right? That you've got better brain scans, more neuroactivity under the influence of psychedelic when there's a positive outcome, right? And the opposite when there's not. And if that's the case, I think that we've got, we're really onto something. So we've created a bit of a consortium of academics, all of whom have been very interested in using these two, pretty standard tools as ways to measure, and really understand what's happening in the brain, which I think is going to be a really fascinating body of data for us to share with the community. At the end of the day, I think that will really, help, and that will, drive more people to look at other types of CNS-derived pain as potential applications for use with psychedelics.
That's outstanding. Well, I'm happy you're here in the space, Greg. This is excellent.
Thank you, man. Yeah, it's great to be here. And great,
there's so much left for you to do, but I'm excited to see your results. And hopefully chat with some of your other researchers in the future too. The pain topic is close.
Yeah, that would we'd love to facilitate. I think you had some really fascinating conversations with people like Dan Claw and Joe Castellanos and Kevin Banke. There's a handful of other people that we were close to, as well. Jennifer Miller has been fantastic. We've done some, kind of early discussions with them, but I think that deep dive, with them in terms of what they're seeing would be, really, really interesting. I guess lastly, I put a little plug in for Robin Carhart-Harris, right, who's chair of our scientific advisory board. And we've just been,
I didn't realize that.
Just over the top, frankly, just thrilled to have him on our SIB and working with him. He's been.
You finally have him in California too, which has to be nice.
It's great to have him here, right? So obviously he just moved from Imperial College over to UC San Francisco. He started back in July. and now he's got his family moved over, which is great. So a little bit of a transition there for him, as I understand. But he navigated his way through. But it's fantastic, scientist, interesting, fellow, and obviously doing some really great work. And glad to have him, here stateside. But he's been so helpful to us as a company, and just guiding us and kind of shaping our overall thoughts and getting us to really think a little more deeply in terms of what this could mean for patients. So there's definitely a lot of people around the company I think that could be helpful, and we're fortunate to be graced by so many phenomenal scientists. Right, it's just a really fortunate spot for us to be in. So we're very grateful for that.
Yeah, excellent. Well, before we wrap, anything you want to mention?
I think that probably covers most of everything. We're pretty excited, as you can tell, to be in a position where we've got so many different studies that are nearly underway, and we'll be in a position soon to be talking more specifically about the data points that come out of those studies, and also hopefully some hints of activity of our novel formulation. But like I said before, we're rooting for everybody. We know there's a lot to be done here. And we certainly are, hopeful that the whole industry, moves forward in a positive way. We think that it's going to be, ultimately really helpful for the medical community to bring this new category of drugs to market. So happy again to play our role in this space. So I just finished with that.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you, Greg. I really appreciate you being here. Really excited to learn more and have you back on in the future. Maybe next time I'm in San Diego or you're in Colorado, we can link up for in person. Yeah,
love it. Yeah, love you in person. Super.
Thanks for being here, Greg.
Yeah. All right. Cheers, man.